Hello and welcome to Lesson 4, Explaining a Concept. This week you'll be reading Chapter 4 in your textbook, which includes essays that explain the concepts of cannibalism, romantic love, hyperthymia, and morality. However, I advise you to skip the essay explaining romantic love. I don't find it particularly helpful. And just like the authors in this chapter, you will be explaining a Christian concept for essay number 2. For this unit's writing assignment, you will produce an essay 2 to 3 pages in length, and just so you know, the page range never includes the title page or the bibliography. On this slide, I have listed several Christian concepts you can write on, such as faith, hope, love, sanctification, redemption, atonement, baptism, Messiah, parable, incarnation, resurrection, Trinity. That list can obviously go on and on. If you have another idea that is not listed below that you would like to write about, please email me as soon as possible so that I can improve your chosen topic. And once you have selected a concept, you'll want to study that concept further through a biblical lens. For this assignment, you are only required to cite the Bible. No other sources are needed. And once you have a good understanding of your concept, you will explain it to your readers, carefully considering what they already know about it and how your essay might add to what they know. And your essay should also address what your concept reveals about the nature and/or character of God and what He desires for humanity. As always, please review the full prompt on the assignment page. Also, refer to the essay rubric to get a better idea of how this essay will be graded. This week, I will also provide a few sample essays. As I mentioned in the welcome video, according to Ephesians 3:8, Paul the Apostle claimed that his calling included preaching the boundless riches of Christ to the Gentiles. We should definitely pray for that same heart if that isn't our desire already. But one thing that can get in the way of our preaching is our use of Christianese. And Christianese is a slang term that refers to the jargon used by Christians. Jargon is defined as the special words used by a particular group that are difficult for those outside that group to understand. It's important that we are aware of Christian jargon because we don't want to unintentionally exclude non-believers or even new believers from biblical or godly conversations because they're unfamiliar with the Christian terms that we use. And this doesn't mean that we should eliminate Christian jargon from our vocabulary, but we should be prepared to define and explain those difficult Christian concepts to people who don't know or understand them. And that is the purpose of the Explain a Concept essay and the reason why I have you pretend that you're explaining the concept you've chosen to someone who is either outside of the Christian faith or a new believer. Since you will be pretending to explain your concept to either a non-believer or a new believer, it will be important to ask yourself a few questions before you start writing. First, you should ask if there's anything that your readers already know about your concept. For instance, you might be writing on love. Obviously, believers and non-believers alike are familiar with this term, but as Christians, we know that the love of God is drastically different than the love the world tries to sell us in secular books or movies. Secondly, you'll also want to think about how you can relate your concept to something that your readers already know. Again, if you're writing on love, you might compare God's love to the love a parent has for his or her child. The third question you might ask yourself is, will my readers already have any misconceptions concerning my concept? For example, some non-believers have misconceptions regarding faith. They think that in order to be a person of faith, you have to reject reason and logic, but we know that that isn't the case. Although there are times where we are called to trust God when life makes little to no sense, we still have the Bible that highlights the many reasons why we should place our hope in God. And the fourth question you should ask yourself is, will I need to arouse my readers' interest about my concept? If you choose a concept like redemption, you may think about those potential readers who don't feel that they need to be redeemed. How will you convince those readers that they should care about redemption? Finally, you can ask yourself, how will I make this information I share relevant to my readers' lives? Ultimately, all of these questions demand that you place yourself in your readers' shoes. Now that you have your target audience in mind, we can move on to talk about your essay's thesis statement, which is, as I've stated before, the most important component of any paper. For this particular assignment, your thesis will need to include your chosen concept and a roadmap that forecasts the 3 subtopics that your essay will cover. If you're a person who enjoys math, you can approach your thesis statement the same way you would tackle a math equation. I'll say it again. Your thesis equals your concept plus your roadmap. And I also want to remind you that a thesis statement is generally 1 to 2 sentences, and it should be placed at the very end of your introduction. And the example I have here is, submission means humbling oneself before God, trusting in His goodness, and surrendering to His will. And I'll break down this thesis statement further on the next slide. The first thing we need to identify from this thesis statement is the concept that the student is discussing. Let's read the thesis example again. Submission means humbling oneself before God, trusting in His goodness, and surrendering to His will. For this example, you should be able to pinpoint that the student's chosen concept is submission. You should also notice that this student provides a roadmap for his readers with, again, 3 subtopics. First, the author will address how submission relates to humility. Secondly, the author will establish why submission requires trust in God's goodness. And finally, I would expect that the student would explain how submission correlates to surrendering to God's will. And I also want to point out that the order of your thesis matters. If your thesis places the topic of humility before the topic of trust, then I would expect the same order to occur in the body paragraphs of your essay. Be aware that you might change the order of your subtopics when you go to write your essay. If that's the case, just remember to revise your thesis statement accordingly. Next, I want to look at one more thesis statement that can be found in your textbook on page 133. Let's read that thesis now. Cannibalism can be broken down into 2 main categories. Exocannibalism, the eating of outsiders or foreigners, and endocannibalism, the eating of members of one's own social group. Within these categories are several functional types of cannibalism, 3 of the most common being survival cannibalism, dietary cannibalism, and religious and ritual cannibalism. Just like the last example, this student's thesis clearly announces his concept, in this case, cannibalism, and his thesis provides a roadmap for his readers. Again, the roadmap helps his readers understand the organization of his paper, making it easier for them to comprehend the content and follow along. In order to explain cannibalism, this student lets his readers know that he plans to divide his concept into 3 parts. Again, the 3 parts are survival cannibalism, dietary cannibalism, and religious and ritual cannibalism. Remember that I'm also requiring you to use 3 subtopics to explain one Christian concept. And this doesn't mean that I want you to fall into the trap of the 5-paragraph essay. The 5-paragraph essay is commonly taught in a high school setting where they require the student to write a paper that includes an introduction, 3 body paragraphs, and a conclusion. Although there is nothing inherently wrong with this format, it isn't the type of structure we want to see at the college level. At this point in your education, your readers will desire a more natural and sophisticated flow. For example, If you look at the student essay about cannibalism, you'll notice that he has one body paragraph dedicated to survival cannibalism. He has 3 body paragraphs devoted to dietary cannibalism, and then he has 3 body paragraphs that explain religious and ritual cannibalism. And that's the sort of variety that you want in your own essay. Now that you know the formula to a thesis statement, it'll be your job to plug in your concept and your subtopics into your equation. If you remember from last week's lesson, I told you that before you sat down to write your essay, you needed to have a thesis statement. But where do you get one of those? Well, it all begins when you pre-write. I recommend that you compose a list of your ideas and then group them. I'll show you what I mean on the next slide. For this example, I'm going to tackle a subject that I know well just for the sake of convenience. So let's say that I wanted to explain what it means to be an English teacher. The first thing I would do is start with a list. I think, okay, an English teacher communicates, explains, for example, the writing process, writes, reads, researches, attends conferences, lesson plans, grades, asks questions, answers questions like emails, holds office hours, and encourages her students. Then I would think, okay, I know my concept. Now I need to find a way to link some of these bullet points into 3 subtopics. And just so you know, you don't have to keep all of your ideas. You're simply brainstorming at this point. So here I've grouped some of the bullet points I know that I want to talk about, and I've found a way to put them under a larger umbrella. A big component of teaching is researching, and under this umbrella, I can talk about how an English teacher reads and attends different conferences in order to glean a variety of tools to help her students grow. Similarly, a teacher goes over grammar and the writing process because her larger goal is to help her students develop their writing skills. Finally, an English teacher offers office hours and answers emails so that her students feel supported. The point of showing you this process is that it's highly unlikely that you can break down any concept into 3 digestible parts on the first go. For example, if you want to talk about love for your essay, I'd start by compiling a list of several verses that address love. This is where your critical thinking comes back into play. As you're annotating your Bible, you will start to see patterns. Multiple verses will highlight how love is patient. Then you'll find another verse that emphasizes how love is sacrificial. And ultimately, it'll be up to you to choose how you want to talk about love. You obviously can't cover all the different facets of love when you only have 2 to 3 pages to work with. Now that we've addressed how we potentially want to group the subtopics of our concept, it's time to write a working thesis statement. Again, this thesis is just to help you get going. You'll want to revisit this thesis continually as you write because things rarely go as planned. If you decide to go a different route, all that means is that you'll need to tweak your thesis to fit your new explanation. And I want to drive home the point that just because we have 3 subtopics doesn't mean that we limit our essays to only 3 body paragraphs. And that's why I showed you the long list I compiled just a few slides ago, because your subtopics, again, are really just umbrellas for the smaller details that you want to write about. For example, remember my first subtopic concerns research. In this paper, body paragraph 1 is dedicated to this subtopic. But for my next subtopic, helping students develop their writing skills, I'll dedicate 2 body paragraphs to this subtopic. Body paragraph 2 will address grammar, and the third body paragraph will address the writing process. Finally, my third subtopic, supporting students, is addressed in body paragraphs 4 and 5. Body paragraph 4 will highlight how an English teacher can be available in person through office hours, and then body paragraph number 5, I'll talk about the importance of having an online presence. And I hope this visual helps you understand how important it is to plan and organize your papers before you sit down to write them. Now, before we move on from thesis statements to topic sentences, I encourage you to have the meal plan handout available when you pre-write and draft every essay from this point on. A large portion of your grade depends on how well you follow this format. As I explained in the last lesson, the M stands for main idea. In every single one of your body paragraphs, you need to begin with a topic sentence that reveals the main idea of your body paragraph. Remember, you can only have one main idea per body paragraph. If you don't have your textbook out and open at this time, please pause this video and go get it. Again, I want you to turn to the essay written about cannibalism on page 132. If you haven't noticed already, every paragraph is numbered, and the paragraph numbers are placed near the spine of your textbook. I want you to look at paragraph 7. The topic sentence for this paragraph reads, "Survival cannibalism occurs when people trapped without food have to decide whether to starve or to eat fellow humans." Based on this topic sentence, we know that the main idea for this paragraph is survival cannibalism, but the student doesn't just say, "Hey readers, now I want to talk to you about survival cannibalism." No, the student simply provides a concise explanation of what survival cannibalism is, and in the subsequent sentences, the student will provide a more detailed or thorough explanation of what he means exactly. This is the type of topic sentence I expect you to write for each of your body paragraphs. Sometimes it helps students to think of a topic sentence as a body paragraph's mini thesis statement, and that you're announcing to your readers what you intend to address, explain, or argue. After you write a topic sentence, it's also necessary for you to evaluate if that topic sentence supports your thesis. If it doesn't, it's likely that you went down a rabbit hole that you never intended to visit, and you'll need to think about whether that paragraph should be cut out or if you should revise your thesis to broaden the scope of your paper. Now that we've addressed thesis statements and topic sentences, I want to give you an example of what the meal plan looks like in action. So let's start with the M. My main idea or topic sentence is that an English teacher helps her students write by teaching them the writing process. Now, I have to prove that the writing process is helpful because that's what I just claimed. In order to prove this assertion, I need to find an outside source that argues exactly that. In your case, you're going to be quoting the Bible. After you've provided evidence, it'll then be your job to explain how your evidence supports the main idea of your body paragraph. And notice that you need more than one piece of evidence to support the explanation of your chosen concept. So even though the acronym is MEAL, practically the E and the A will repeat. Finally, you will link your current main idea to the next main idea that you'll address in your subsequent body paragraph. In this example, my link is, "But it isn't enough for her to just tell her students what they must do to write. She must also be there while they write." After you determine the basic organization and the structure of your essay, it's time to think about how you will present your information to your readers. To talk about the appropriate explanatory strategies that you can use for your essay, let's go back to the first concept that I mentioned, submission. First, know that you can simply provide a definition for submission. For example, submission is yielding to the will of another person. Secondly, you can classify or group together related material by explaining to your readers that believers and non-believers alike practice submission daily. Next, you can use compare and contrast and perhaps address the similarities or differences between a believer submitting to God and a child submitting to a parent. Fourthly, you can address submission as a process. Perhaps you feel that the first step in submission is nurturing a humble heart, followed by step 2, 3, and 4. Fifthly, you can illustrate with examples. Maybe you want to explain submission by talking about how it functions in the workplace. Finally, you might want to report the causes and effects related to your concept. For instance, when a believer submits to God, God then honors the believer's decision to walk by faith. Really, the sky's the limit. I encourage you to have this list handy while you pre-write and think about which strategies make the most sense for the Christian concept of your choosing. Next, I want to talk about quoting the Bible. As you learned in Lesson 3, it's important to smoothly integrate your quotes. You'll probably hear me say this a million times this semester, but you want to avoid dropped quotations or quotations that stand alone as sentences because your readers will be tempted to skip over them. Your quotes are more likely to be received when they don't interrupt the natural flow of your paper. A dropped quotation can often feel like a bump in the road, so again, avoid them when you can. Still, I don't want to deter you from referencing an outside source because your readers also want to know that you've done your research. Think about those pastors who deliver sermons that never require you to crack open your Bible. This sort of scenario makes me question whether I'm learning biblical truths or just one man's interpretation of God's word. Finally, don't forget that you can also paraphrase. Just remember that paraphrases require in-text citations too. So, citing the Bible is unique for two reasons. First, you use parenthetical notes instead of footnotes. Secondly, you also don't need to include an entry for the Bible in your bibliography, which means you don't need a bibliography for this paper unless you choose to use other outside sources. I also want to point out that an abbreviation of the version should be included in your parenthetical note. In this case, the student used the New King James Version, and notice there's no comma between the reference and the version. Also, the final period is placed after the parenthetical note as displayed in the final example on this slide. I also want to briefly mention that if you quote a verse that amounts to more than 5 lines, you will need to use a block quotation as shown here. And as always, I want to end this lesson by encouraging you once again to pre-write before you start drafting. Many students think that outlines are a waste of time because they're haunted by the memories of when they were required to write those super in-depth outlines with a million subpoints in high school. But you should know that outlines can be simple, and they definitely make that blinking cursor on a blank page less daunting. Because conclusions are often neglected, especially in comparison to introductions that get all the love, I also want to remind you that instead of summarizing your paper in your conclusion, you want to make sure that you restate your thesis statement and address the so what in your final paragraph. You may also want to suggest what is special about your concept, relate the ending of your essay to the beginning. That's a popular and effective strategy. It also helps your ideas come full circle. Or you can give your readers a call to action. For instance, if you are writing a paper on water conservation, you might give your readers a few practical ways they could save water, like taking shorter showers or watering their plants at night. The final thing that I want to bring to your attention before ending this video is that on pages 175 through 177, your textbook provides some helpful suggestions for revising your draft. I also want to remind you that you can always use me as a resource. Although I don't read entire drafts, I'm always willing to review your thesis statement or go over one of your body paragraphs to ensure that you understand how to follow the meal plan. It's my hope that you enjoy the Explain a Concept essay and that it helps you to feel more confident as the Lord opens opportunities for you to speak to non-believers or new believers about the things of God. And perhaps the Lord will give you a divine appointment in the upcoming weeks. So keep a lookout and happy writing.